Pastor Malcolm Reeves had always believed his life had a singular purpose: to serve God and his community. Born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, he was the youngest of 3 children in a deeply religious household. His father had been a deacon at their local church, a man of discipline and quiet faith who worked long hours at a steel mill to provide for his family. His mother, a kind but firm woman, spent her days volunteering at shelters, making sure that no soul in the neighborhood went hungry. Their home was small, a modest 2-bedroom house in South Memphis, but it was always filled with warmth, the scent of cornbread baking in the oven, and the sound of gospel music playing on Sunday mornings. From an early age, Malcolm had shown a devotion to Scripture that was rare for a boy his age. While other children played football in the streets or ran through the parks until dusk, Malcolm spent hours sitting beside his grandmother, listening as she read from the Bible. He memorized verses, absorbing their meaning, letting the words settle into his heart like seeds waiting to bloom. By the time he was 13, he had already begun leading small prayer groups for the youth in his neighborhood. He spoke with conviction, his voice steady even when his hands trembled. People often said he had an old soul, that wisdom seemed to rest on his shoulders like a heavy but familiar coat. As he grew older, his path became clear. He excelled in his studies, earning a scholarship to a small but respected theological seminary in Nashville. There, he immersed himself in scripture, theology, and pastoral leadership. He studied the works of great preachers, those whose voices had stirred movements and brought lost souls back to God. He learned how to counsel those in crisis, how to lead a congregation with humility and grace. But no amount of training could have prepared him for the weight of responsibility that came with being a shepherd of the people. After graduation, Malcolm returned to Memphis, eager to put his calling into action. At 28, he was appointed as the pastor of Ascension Baptist Church, a once thriving congregation that had dwindled in numbers over the years. The building itself bore the signs of neglect: cracks in the stained glass windows, peeling paint on the wooden pews, a leaky roof that dripped steadily when the rain came. But the spirit of the church, the faith of its people, remained unbroken. Malcolm threw himself into his work with an energy that was both inspiring and exhausting. He visited the sick and elderly in their homes, sat with grieving families, and spent countless nights praying with those who had lost their way. He launched programs to feed the homeless, to mentor at-risk youth, to provide shelter for battered women. He worked tirelessly, often running on little sleep, fueled only by his belief that this was his divine mission. The people of Memphis took notice. Over the years, Ascension Baptist Church became a beacon of hope once more. Attendance grew, donations increased, and the church expanded its outreach. His sermons were not just words, they were fire and light, lifting the spirits of those who felt forgotten. He spoke of redemption, of second chances, of the love of God that could heal even the most broken hearts. People left his services feeling renewed, their burdens lighter. He was not just a preacher, he was a leader, a counselor, a man whose faith seemed unshakable. But Malcolm was still human. Among the many faces that filled the pews every Sunday, one began to stand out more than the others. Julia Carroll was a woman of quiet grace, her beauty understated but undeniable. She carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength, but her eyes held a sadness that never quite disappeared, even when she smiled. She had been attending Ascension Baptist for years, always sitting in the same place, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Malcolm had known her as a devoted member of the congregation, a woman who volunteered tirelessly for the church's charity drives and community projects. But he had never truly seen her, not in the way he did now. At first, it was just a flicker of recognition, a passing thought. He noticed the way she bowed her head in prayer, the way she listened intently to his sermons, how her gaze lingered just a second longer than it should when their eyes met across the sanctuary. He dismissed it as nothing. He was a pastor, he saw people, he cared for them. That was his duty. But then came the moments he couldn't ignore. She would stay behind after service to help clean up, and he would find himself watching her, his attention lingering when it shouldn't. They would cross paths in the hallway, exchanging pleasantries, but there was something beneath the surface, something unspoken. A tension, a pull. He told himself it was nothing more than admiration, that his thoughts were simply a test of faith. Julia was married. Her husband, Sergeant Darrell Carroll, served in the Navy and was frequently deployed overseas. She spent long months alone, raising their 2 children, carrying the weight of responsibility on her own. Malcolm had counseled her before, had seen the strain in her face when she spoke about the challenges of being a military wife. He had admired her strength, the way she kept moving forward despite the loneliness. But admiration was dangerous. It could shift, transform into something else if not kept in check. He prayed on it. He asked God to guide him, to rid him of thoughts that had no place in his mind. He threw himself deeper into his work, hoping that if he filled his days with enough tasks, there would be no room left for temptation. But avoidance did not erase desire. One evening, after a late-night planning session for an upcoming charity event, Malcolm walked Julia to her car. The church parking lot was nearly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. She thanked him for his guidance, for the way he had helped her find strength through faith. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the gratitude. And then, for just a second, he saw something else. It was a moment, small, fleeting, but enough to shake him. A hesitation before she turned away, an almost imperceptible longing in her expression. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched her drive off, his hands tightening into fists. This was temptation. He had spent his entire life building a reputation of righteousness, of unwavering faith. He had guided others through their struggles, had preached about resisting sin, about the dangers of giving in to worldly desires. But now, he stood at the edge of the very precipice he had warned others about. For the first time in his life, Malcolm Reeves felt truly afraid. Malcolm tried to suppress his thoughts of Julia, to bury them beneath his work, his prayers, and his devotion to his congregation. He convinced himself that what he felt was nothing more than admiration, a fleeting test of his discipline. He reminded himself of his responsibilities, of his oath to God, of the trust that had been placed in him. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, the feeling did not fade. It grew, quietly at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind, but soon it became something more, a constant presence, an ache that would not leave him. Each Sunday, as he stood at the pulpit, delivering his sermon with his usual conviction, he felt the weight of her gaze. He told himself that it was his imagination, that he was reading too much into her expression, but deep down, he knew the truth. Julia was watching him, just as he was watching her. Their paths crossed more often than they should have. She was deeply involved in the church's charitable work, organizing food drives, coordinating fundraisers, volunteering for community outreach. There were meetings to attend, plans to discuss, events that required their collaboration. Each time they found themselves alone in the same room, an invisible force pulled them toward one another, an energy that neither of them dared to acknowledge aloud. At first, it was small things, a brief touch as she handed him a stack of papers, the way her fingers brushed his when she passed him a pen. These moments should have meant nothing, but they lingered. He would find himself thinking about them hours later, replaying them in his mind, feeling the warmth of her touch long after it had faded. One evening, after a long meeting about an upcoming community event, the tension between them reached its peak. The other volunteers had left, and the church was quiet, the sanctuary dimly lit by the golden glow of the candles on the altar. Malcolm stood by the pews, gathering his notes, while Julia lingered near the doorway. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy, charged with something unspoken. And then, without thinking, without planning, they moved toward each other. It was hesitant at first, a slow, uncertain closeness. His hand found hers in the dim light, their fingers intertwining with a quiet inevitability. He could hear the sound of his own breathing, the pounding of his heart in his chest. The air between them felt thick, suffocating, yet he had never felt more alive. He knew he should step away, that this was the moment to stop, to walk out of the church and never look back. But he didn't. The first touch of their lips was tentative, almost afraid. But as soon as it happened, there was no going back. A dam had broken, releasing everything they had kept locked away for too long. The kiss deepened, their bodies pressed together in the dimly lit church, the sacred walls around them bearing witness to their transgression. When they finally pulled away, neither of them spoke. There was no need. What had just happened had changed everything. From that night on, they stole whatever moments they could. At first, they were careful, making sure that no one would suspect anything. Their encounters were brief, brushed hands beneath the table during meetings, glances that lasted a second too long, words that carried hidden meanings. But as the weeks passed, their restraint weakened. They found excuses to see each other, slipping away in the quiet hours of the evening, meeting in the church's back office where no one would disturb them. There were late-night phone calls, whispers of longing, the quiet confession of emotions they could no longer deny. Malcolm tried to reason with himself, to justify what they were doing. He told himself that it would not last forever, that it was only temporary, that he would stop before it went too far. He prayed for strength, but every time he was near her, his resolve crumbled. He had spent his entire life resisting temptation, preaching about the dangers of sin. But in Julia's arms, sin did not feel like sin. It felt like salvation. They thought they were being careful. They thought no one knew. But in a church, nothing remained secret for long. The whispers began quietly, murmurs exchanged between the older women in the congregation. They noticed how Malcolm seemed distracted during his sermons, how he had begun avoiding certain people, how Julia lingered a little too long after the services. Some had seen her leaving his office late at night, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression unreadable. The rumors spread like wildfire. At first, they were vague, a suggestion, a question left hanging in the air. But soon, they took shape, turning into something undeniable. People talked, exchanged knowing glances, watched the way Malcolm and Julia moved around each other. And then, the whispers reached the ears of the one man who should never have heard them. Darrell Carroll had always trusted his wife. He had been gone for long stretches before, had spent months overseas, knowing that she would be waiting for him when he returned. But when he came back this time, something felt different. Julia was distant, distracted. She avoided his gaze when he asked about her days, seemed restless in a way she never had before. And then he heard the rumors. At first, he dismissed them. His wife would never betray him. His pastor, his spiritual guide, the man he had trusted with his faith, would never cross that line. But the doubts took root in his mind, growing like a poison. He started watching her more closely, paying attention to the little details he had once ignored. The way she checked her phone late at night, the way she left the house early on Sunday mornings, the way her expression shifted when he mentioned Malcolm's name. Darrell was a man of discipline, of control. But as the days passed, his control began to slip. He needed proof. And when he found it, the anger that had been simmering inside him turned into something far more dangerous. Darrell Carroll arrived home earlier than expected, stepping through the front door of his Memphis home with the quiet confidence of a man who believed in order, duty, and faith. His return was meant to be a surprise, another homecoming after months away on deployment, another reunion where his wife would greet him with open arms, their children running toward him with laughter. But the house felt different. The air inside was heavy, charged with something he couldn't quite place. He set his duffel bag down by the door, listening to the silence. Julia was in the kitchen, moving slowly, methodically, as if lost in thought. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Long separations had a way of making things feel unfamiliar. It took time to adjust, to slip back into the rhythm of family life. He watched her carefully over the next few days, searching for signs of joy, of relief that he had returned safely. But the warmth in her smile felt forced, the embraces too brief, the way she looked at him, different. There was distance in her eyes, something guarded. She would reach for her phone when she thought he wasn't looking, staring at the screen as if waiting for a message she couldn't ignore. When he asked her if something was wrong, she shook her head, forcing a smile that did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. Darrell was a man of discipline, a man trained to assess situations with logic and precision. But suspicion had a way of unraveling even the most controlled minds. The whispers reached him a week later. He had been catching up with an old friend, a fellow officer in the Memphis police force, when the words slipped out casually, almost as an afterthought. The man chuckled, shaking his head, saying that people talked too much, that small towns and church congregations had a way of making scandals out of thin air. But the damage had been done. Darrell sat frozen, his mind catching on the words like a hook lodged deep in his flesh. The pastor and his wife. Too close. The phrase echoed in his skull, bouncing off the walls of his reason. At first, he refused to believe it. Julia had been faithful to him through every deployment, every absence, every hardship that came with being a military wife. She was a woman of faith, of integrity. And Pastor Malcolm Reeves? He was a man of God, a leader, a figure that Darrell himself had turned to for guidance more times than he could count. The idea was absurd. It was gossip, the kind of mindless chatter that people indulged in when they had nothing better to do. But once doubt took root, it spread like wildfire. Darrell began to watch more closely. Julia no longer reached for him at night. She moved around the house with an air of quiet distraction, as if always thinking of something or someone else. When they sat together at dinner, she barely touched her food, her eyes distant, her thoughts elsewhere. Then came the first real proof. One evening, as she showered, he noticed her purse left open on the bedroom dresser. It wasn't like him to pry, but something compelled him forward, an unseen force guiding his hands as he reached inside. His fingers brushed against paper, and when he pulled it out, he saw her handwriting. It wasn't a letter, not exactly. A folded page from a journal, a scribbled confession, half-finished and raw. Words of longing, of guilt. Mentions of God and sin, of impossible desires. She never named him, but Darrell didn't need to see the name to know who it was about. The air left his lungs. His hands trembled. Over the next few days, he gathered more evidence, each discovery striking him like a fresh wound. A scarf of hers left in the back office of the church, a late-night phone call cut off abruptly when he entered the room, a small silver cross necklace tucked away in a drawer that he knew had never belonged to her. And then there was the way she looked at Malcolm during Sunday service. Darrell sat in the back of the church that morning, watching his wife when she thought no one else was. The sermon echoed around them, but he heard none of it. His eyes followed Julia as she sat in the front row, her head slightly tilted, her lips parted just enough to reveal the breath she held. She wasn't just listening. She was seeing him. Malcolm's words flowed with passion, with conviction, but Darrell saw what others did not, the stolen glances, the momentary falter in the pastor's voice when his gaze locked with hers. It was real. The betrayal was real. Something inside Darrell snapped. He left the church before the final prayer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The ground felt unsteady beneath him, as if the very foundation of his life had begun to crack. He had spent his entire career as a man of action, of strategy. He had survived war zones, had seen men break under pressure, had faced the kind of violence most people only knew from the news. But nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't the kind of enemy he could fight with his fists. He spent that night in silence, lying awake beside Julia as she slept peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing inches away from her. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every clue he had ignored. By morning, he knew what he had to do. Sunday arrived again, and Darrell dressed carefully, methodically. He chose his best suit, pressed and sharp, the uniform of a man who demanded respect. He moved with purpose, his expression unreadable, his hand steady. He left the house without a word, his car cutting through the quiet streets of Memphis like a blade through flesh. The church loomed ahead, its white walls pristine against the morning sky, a sanctuary for the faithful. For the betrayed, it would become something else entirely. He stepped inside, walking down the aisle with slow, deliberate strides. People turned to look at him, offering nods, polite smiles, unaware of the tempest he carried within him. He barely saw them. His eyes were fixed ahead, locked on the man standing at the altar, the man who had stolen everything sacred from him. Pastor Malcolm Reeves stood tall, the weight of his role pressing down on his shoulders, oblivious to the reckoning about to unfold. Darrell kept walking. He had found his justice. And before the service was over, the whole world would bear witness to it. The church was alive with the hum of voices, the rustling of Sunday best, the quiet shuffle of feet settling into the pews. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, fresh lilies arranged by the altar, and the faint musk of old hymnals that had been held by generations of hands. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned reflections on the polished floor, illuminating the bowed heads of those who had come seeking peace, solace, and the unwavering certainty of faith. At the front of the sanctuary, Pastor Malcolm Reeves stood tall, his hands resting lightly on the wooden pulpit. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the sacred space as he spoke of redemption, of the power of confession, of the heavy burden of sin. But beneath the steady cadence of his words, turmoil raged within him. His heart pounded against his ribs, his palms damp with a nervous sweat that had nothing to do with the heat of the crowded room. The guilt had become unbearable. He had spent the past few nights pacing the floor of his office, his Bible open but unread on his desk. He had prayed for guidance, for absolution, for a way to undo the damage he had caused. But God had remained silent. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him like a stone, suffocating, inescapable. He had decided that today would be the day. He would tell the truth. His congregation had trusted him, had looked to him for guidance, for strength, for unwavering morality. He had failed them. He had failed himself. He had sinned, and there was no hiding from it anymore. He exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of the pulpit as he prepared to speak words that would shatter everything he had built. And then the doors of the church burst open. The heavy wooden doors crashed against the walls with a force that sent a sharp crack echoing through the sanctuary. Heads turned, startled whispers rippling through the pews as a tall figure stepped inside. The bright sunlight from outside framed him in stark contrast to the dim interior, his broad shoulders casting long shadows across the polished floor. Darrell Carroll stood at the entrance, his stance rigid, his face unreadable. He took a step forward, the sound of his shoes striking the floor unnervingly loud in the stunned silence. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, locked onto Malcolm with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down the pastor's spine. A slow murmur spread through the congregation. Some recognized him immediately, Julia's husband, the military man, the one who was always away, always absent. Others simply sensed the tension in the air, the way his presence seemed to darken the light that had filled the church moments before. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. Darrell walked with deliberate slowness, his movements precise, controlled. The pews on either side of him were filled with people shifting uncomfortably, mothers instinctively drawing their children closer, elderly women clutching their prayer books a little tighter. He stopped at the foot of the altar, standing just a few feet away from where Malcolm stood behind the pulpit. His hands were clenched at his sides, his shoulders squared. The room was so silent that the distant ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Then he spoke. His voice was low at first, but it carried through the sanctuary like a storm rolling in from the horizon. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a hammer blow, each accusation cutting through the still air like a blade. He spoke of betrayal, of deception, of a man of God who had dared to take what did not belong to him. The congregation gasped as the realization set in. Eyes darted between Malcolm and Darrell, confusion giving way to horror, to disbelief. Julia sat frozen in the front pew, her face drained of color, her hands trembling where they rested in her lap. Malcolm tried to speak, tried to find words that would somehow make this moment less catastrophic. But nothing could stop what was coming. Darrell reached into his jacket. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed suspended in time. The room held its breath, the sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows suddenly too bright, too harsh. Then the gun was in his hand. A scream cut through the air, followed by the panicked rustling of people scrambling to move, to run, to shield their children. Some ducked behind the pews, others remained frozen in place, too shocked to react. Malcolm barely had time to take a step back before the gun was raised, the barrel aimed directly at him. The shot rang out, deafening in the vast space of the sanctuary. The impact hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. The force knocked him backward, his body colliding with the pulpit before he collapsed to his knees. A burning heat spread across his torso, blooming outward like fire beneath his ribs. He looked down, dazed, watching as crimson stained the front of his white robe, the color stark against the purity of the fabric. A second passed. Then another. The silence shattered. Screams erupted, chairs overturned as people rushed toward the exits, their terror echoing through the sanctuary. Others ran forward, their cries of shock and disbelief mixing with the sound of wailing children and the frantic calls for someone to call 911. Julia pushed through the chaos, dropping to her knees beside Malcolm, her hands pressing desperately against the wound, trying to stop the impossible. Blood seeped through her fingers, warm and slick, pulsing with every fading beat of his heart. Malcolm's vision blurred. The voices around him became distant, muffled, as if he were sinking beneath water. His breath came in shallow gasps, the pain radiating outward in waves. He lifted his gaze, his eyes drifting upward toward the wooden crucifix hanging above the altar. Darrell stood motionless, the gun slipping from his grasp, clattering to the floor. He did not run. He did not fight when hands grabbed him, dragging him away, restraining him. His face remained unchanged, his eyes locked onto the scene before him with an emptiness that spoke of a man who had already lost everything. Malcolm's lips parted, a silent prayer slipping from his tongue, but no sound came. His body felt lighter, the edges of his vision fading into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. But for him, it was already over. The news of the shooting spread with the force of an unstoppable wave, crashing through Memphis and beyond. Within hours, headlines blared across television screens, newspaper covers, and social media feeds. A respected pastor, gunned down at the altar by a betrayed husband. A story soaked in scandal, morality, and blood. The details were too sensational to ignore. Local reporters stood outside Ascension Baptist Church, their voices carrying over the sounds of sirens and sobbing congregants. Camera crews captured the aftermath, streaks of blood on the church floor, abandoned hymnals scattered in the chaos, police officers escorting a silent Darrell Carroll in handcuffs. By the next morning, national networks had picked up the story. It was more than a murder, it was a fall from grace. Malcolm Reeves had been a pillar of the community, a man whose words had once lifted the weary, whose actions had given hope to those who had none. But now, his name carried an asterisk, a shadow of disgrace. Some called him a martyr, a man cut down by another's rage. Others whispered that it was divine justice, a reckoning for his sins. The funeral was held 3 days later. The church, once filled with voices raised in worship, now echoed with quiet sobs. Rows of mourners sat in silence, their faces etched with grief, disbelief, or judgment. A choir sang softly, their voices trembling, struggling to find harmony amid the sorrow. The casket rested at the front of the sanctuary, draped in white cloth, adorned with lilies. Not everyone came to say goodbye. Some members of the congregation refused to attend, unable to reconcile the man they had followed with the truth that had been exposed. Others stood at the back, murmuring about betrayal and consequences, their expressions cold. Among those who did come, the emotions were divided: mourning, anger, confusion. Julia Carroll was not among them. She had vanished from the public eye, her absence as deafening as the gunshot that had ended Malcolm's life. Some said she had gone to stay with distant relatives, unable to face the shame. Others claimed she had checked into a small motel outside the city, too grief-stricken to leave her room. No one knew for sure. Darrell Carroll remained in custody, his expression unreadable when he appeared in court for his first hearing. The weight of his actions sat heavy on him, but he did not weep, did not plead. He stood before the judge in his prison-issued jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his gaze steady. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, reporters, community members, former parishioners, all eager to witness the reckoning. The prosecution built their case swiftly. They painted a picture of premeditated rage, of a man who had allowed jealousy to consume him. They described how Darrell had walked into that church with murder in his heart, how he had fired that gun in cold blood, how he had shattered a congregation with a single bullet. They demanded life in prison, arguing that his crime was one of calculated revenge, not a moment of passion. The defense countered with a plea of temporary insanity, claiming that Darrell had been pushed to the edge, that the betrayal had fractured something deep within him. They called experts to testify about the psychological impact of infidelity, about the toll that long military deployments took on a man's mind. They presented him as a victim of deceit, of heartbreak, of circumstance. Witnesses took the stand one by one. A deacon from the church spoke of Malcolm's years of service, of his devotion to his faith, but when pressed, his voice wavered. He was a good man, he said, but his words carried hesitation, doubt. A longtime church member spoke about the whispers that had spread before the tragedy, about the looks exchanged between the pastor and Julia, about the late-night meetings behind closed doors. People noticed, she admitted. People talked. A forensic psychologist explained how Darrell had returned from deployment to find his entire world altered, how betrayal had pushed him into an emotional free fall. Rage like that, he said, can make a man see only one path forward. Through it all, Darrell remained silent. He listened as his fate was debated, as his actions were dissected. He did not flinch when the prosecution replayed the security footage from inside the church, grainy black and white images showing him walking down the aisle, raising the gun, firing. The moment Malcolm fell played on a loop in the minds of everyone present. When the trial neared its end, the prosecution made their final argument. This was not justice, the lead attorney said, her voice firm. This was not the act of a man defending his honor. This was murder. The defense, in their closing remarks, asked for leniency. This was a man undone by grief, by betrayal, they pleaded. A man who had given his life to his country, only to return to find his home, his family, his faith stolen from him. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The city held its breath. When they returned, the courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty. Not of first-degree murder, as the prosecution had wanted. The jury, perhaps moved by the defense's argument, found him guilty of second-degree murder. A crime of passion, not premeditation. A killing born from impulse rather than careful planning. The sentence came swiftly. 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The judge's voice carried no emotion as he delivered the ruling. The weight of justice, harsh enough to punish, lenient enough to acknowledge the wounds that had led to this moment. Darrell did not react. He did not argue, did not plead for mercy. He simply nodded, accepting the punishment, as if he had already sentenced himself long before the court had done so. As he was led away in handcuffs, the eyes of the city remained on him. Some saw a murderer. Some saw a broken man. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled for statements, microphones thrust into the faces of church members, legal experts, and bystanders. No one spoke of Julia. She was a ghost now, her name only whispered, her presence erased from the city. And in the sanctuary of Ascension Baptist, the pews remained emptier than before, the echoes of the past still clinging to the walls, a wound that time alone could not heal. Years passed, but Ascension Baptist Church was never the same. The walls still stood, the stained glass windows still bathed the sanctuary in colored light, and the pulpit remained at the front of the congregation. But something unseen had been lost, something fragile that could not be restored with paint or careful repair. Faith, once unshakable, had been tested in the most brutal of ways. The congregation had dwindled. Some left in the weeks following the shooting, unable to reconcile their devotion with the events that had unfolded in the place they once considered sacred. Others remained, but their worship was different now, quieter, more hesitant, as if the very air carried the weight of sin and consequence. The whispers of what had happened never truly faded, lingering in the corners of the church like an unshaken shadow. Some called it divine punishment, a reckoning for hypocrisy, for secrets too long buried. They spoke of Malcolm Reeves as a man who had fallen from grace, his death a lesson from a God who would not tolerate deceit among his messengers. They pointed to the empty pews as proof that the church had been tainted, that its foundation had been built on something less than pure. Others saw it differently. To them, it was not God's wrath, but the weakness of man. The tragedy had not been the hand of a vengeful deity, but the result of flawed choices, of desires left unchecked, of a love that should never have been. They mourned Malcolm not as a sinner, but as a man who had lost his way. And they mourned Darrell as well, not just for what he had done, but for what he had lost in doing it. Inside the prison walls, Darrell Carroll became another forgotten man. Time moved differently there, the outside world shrinking into a distant, unreachable place. He did not resist his sentence, nor did he fight against the slow decay of his days. He lived as a man who had already died in some way long before he had stepped into that church with a gun in his hand. His name faded from headlines, his story replaced by newer scandals, fresher crimes. He had been a man of discipline, a soldier trained to survive, but in the end, it was not war that had destroyed him, it was love, betrayal, and the storm that followed. Julia Carroll became a ghost of her former self. She never returned to Memphis. She disappeared into the folds of another city, another life, though she carried her shame with her wherever she went. Some claim to have seen her once, years later, sitting alone in the back of a small church in Atlanta, her face partially hidden beneath a scarf, her hands clasped in silent prayer. Others believed she had left the country entirely, unable to live among those who would never let her forget. But at Ascension Baptist, there were those who still came, Sunday after Sunday, to kneel before the altar where Malcolm Reeves had fallen. The blood had long since been scrubbed away, but its presence was felt nonetheless, as if the floor itself remembered. They did not speak his name aloud, nor did they mention the sin that had led to his end. But they prayed. Not just for him, but for Darrell, for Julia, for themselves. For every soul that had ever wandered from the path, for every heart that had been tempted by desires they could not control. They prayed for forgiveness, for understanding, for the kind of grace that only God could give. And in the stillness of that sanctuary, where faith had once flourished and nearly died, the echoes of those prayers remained, carried up toward the heavens, waiting to be answered.